Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery, and today's class is on what is perfect soil. So pretty much we'll be telling you some of the reasons we made our top potting soil. How many folks have seen this class before? Good. So we'll start us with the basics. So what makes the soil really good? So what we know about plants, the requirements of plants or the soil itself, is a regular plant and the roots of the plant. So when I was a kid, they always, in biology, like in elementary school, junior high school, they always made a diagram of a tree, mirror images, branches, and roots. But now we know tree roots don't go deep at all. They may go down a foot in a city, and that's because they need to breathe air. So if they're too deep, they can't breathe unless they're planted in gravel. So if you have a tree in a mountain gorge that's just crushed rock, sometimes roots go down 20 foot in that gravel because they can still breathe. But generally in a city, you don't find roots below a foot. They do travel wide. So the U.S. Forest Department has said that tree roots grow 3 to 20 times wider than the tree is tall. But rarely do you find, in nature, you might find a few roots below a foot, hardly anything below 2 feet. It's just in that range. In fact, they said most of the roots of the plant are in the top 10 inches or 12 inches of soil. So, but of course, any plant that's got leaves and it's actively growing, it needs water. And if you've got if today was 80 degrees, say 50% humidity, and the soil was bone dry, this plant would start wilting within just a few hours or so out in that sun. So they just have to have a constant supply of moisture. So number one, they've got to be able to, the soil's got to be able to supply water to the roots. Number two, which I just mentioned, is they need to breathe air. So the proper term is gas exchange. So the part of the plant that makes the oxygen are these chloroplasts in the leaves. They're actually converting carbon dioxide in the air and water to get from the soil into sugars, and a byproduct of that is oxygen. Oxygen is used for all the processes that, growth processes, damage control, uh, just regular living. They need the oxygen to burn the sugar to go back to energy, to release energy that they got from the sun originally. Uh, Now, unfortunately, plants are not like people. We can breathe in our mouth, and our blood circulates the oxygen throughout every cell of our body. Whereas in a plant, the oxygen goes out the pores in the leaf, through the air, through the soil, to the roots. Now, it is true roots don't need as much oxygen as we do, or else, you bury us in the ground, we'd be dead in 10 minutes. Um, Plant roots can live in the soil under those low oxygen levels, but they still need it. And apparently, plant roots can hold their breath for about 2 days. So if there's no oxygen for more than 2 days, they get in trouble. So they have a much lower need for oxygen than we do. Now, there are a lot of tolerances among plants. Just so you know, the plants on this side can tolerate low oxygen levels in the ground. The plants on this side cannot. So we know that in the trade, the research has shown that things like lavender, the book says ferns, azaleas, things like that. Our orchids need a lot of oxygens, and we know that. But these are the plants that we know that they don't have oxygen, they rot real easy. Gardenias, lavenders, a lot of the native plants, ceanothus, the native sages, uh, strawberries, among fruit trees, avocado, very prone to root rot. So if the oxygen level gets too low, the root rot organisms are promoted. They operate best under low oxygen levels. and that's what causes root rot. It's not necessarily the water. Just so you know, that people grow avocado pits in a glass of water. We just started this up a few weeks ago, and there's root coming out into the water. So clean water, you can say well oxygenated water because it's got access to the atmosphere. This avocado can grow in there for a long, long time. No drainage. Drainage is overrated. Overwatering is overrated. This is, they say avocados root rot, but this is sitting in water. So can't be the water itself. The plants on this side can tolerate lower oxygen levels. Surprisingly, roses, grasses, a lot of lilies, plants in the myrtle family, which include guavas, eucalyptus, things of that type. Tomato plants, conifers like pines, junipers, cedars, cypresses. Palm trees also are on this side. Got my palm tree in here. But that's what you see people have success with. Bird of paradise is on this side too. So though, and I should have brought in one more. Impatiens, known to tolerate low bad conditions. So those are the plants that people usually have success with. Plants on this side, which we used to grow a lot of, people don't choose them much because they keep killing them. With the way we're handling soil nowadays, it just keeps dying. Anyway, water, gas exchange, so they need the oxygen around the roots. 3, insulation. So the roots only operate, well, when the plant's active, they like to be around 50 degrees to maybe 85 degrees. They don't like to go, if our summertime, the temperature is 100, 110, that cooks the roots. They don't like it that hot. So the soil's got to be able to insulate them from that heat, plus the cold. If they freeze, they're dead. So on the lower 49 states of the United States, the ground does not freeze unless you're on top of a mountain somewhere. So the soil insulates the roots for stability, keeps them upright. You don't want them falling over. And that's pretty much it. I used to write down on here, 20 years ago when I started these classes, I used to write down on here nutrition. But most plants do not get their nutrition from the soil. And that's the problem with their industry. Our industry thinks if it's not nutritious, it can't work as soil. They keep on telling people to use compost as soil because real dirt has no nutrition. Well, it doesn't. It's not intended to for most plants. They get their nutrition from the surface of the soil. We'll talk about that a little bit. So, what is soil? Real soil is called loam, LOAM. And we see the definition of loam being all messed up by modern journalists that say, well, okay, yeah, a rich loam has a lot of organic matter. Well, that's not what loam means. Loam means that the soil has the 3 major parts. Turn the page. Has the 3 major components that make up good, good dirt, good growing areas. The loam means that the soil has sand, silt, and clay. Now, everybody knows what sand is. Silt is just smaller pieces of sand. Clay are like microscopic flakes. You can't see individual particles of clay, but it's like, you can say it's like confetti, real flat flakes of soil. And how is it created? So soil is just broken down granite. So this used to be a piece of granite a long time ago. So granite, the lighter parts are quartz, which is silicon dioxide, which is the same as glass. So soil and glass, and if you lightning hits the ground, you can get glass or pottery because that's what soil is. When you overheat it, it just melts and turns them back into something solid. Um, anyway, the granite breaks down from the mountains becomes decomposed granite off the side of the hill. Once the river gets to it, once it drops into the river churns it up and it takes it down to the smaller particles of sand, which is primarily quartz. You look at sand underneath the magnifying glass, it's more or less a clear piece of, it looks like quartz, except miniature. And silt is just a smaller piece of sand that's been rounded down again by the rivers. And then the clay, the dark specks in granite are feldspar, which is when silicon dioxide is combined with other minerals like iron, if it's brownish or reddish, or aluminum, grayish, or some other minerals, makes the feldspar, and that becomes flat flakes of clay in the soil. So there's three components. It's just, again, it's just a rock ground down into small pieces. So sand is relatively round. Silt is also relatively round. Clay, again, is really small, flat flakes. Um, Now, the way that it provides what we're talking about, moisture, airflow, and all the soil particles have a negative charge. What I've been told, I haven't done the test myself, but all these particles have a negative charge. So any ionic particle, and water happens to be an ionic particle. Water is an oxygen and two hydrogens connected on one side. That makes this positive on this side. This is negative on this side. So it's got a charge on it. One side is positive, one side is more negative. And since these are negative charge, they stick to the surface of this particle, one molecule thick, really strongly. And it'd be hard to get that layer of water off this particle unless it's really heated up pretty high. Now, one layer is really strongly attached, but there's a lot of water attractiveness around there because of the charge. They're not adhering quite as hard as that first layer is, but they're all attracted to it. There's a new, they're talking about a new state of water that's not quite solid, not quite liquid, that's all, charged like this next to particles. So they're saying that they have to create a um, new types of physics to handle what that water is doing when it's stuck to things, because it doesn't act like regular liquid water. Another form of water, they say. So anyway, the water sticks to these particles at least one molecule thick. Clay, for its size, holds a lot of water because clay molecules may be as small as 28 molecules thick, whereas sand particles are thousands of molecules thick. So the clay still holds that one layer of water really hard, but that's a lot of water compared to clay. So if you have a foot of dry sand, what we know about dry sand, if you put water over it and start dripping water on it, it'll take about a half inch of water to completely saturate or fill the spaces that sand can hold. So 1 foot of sand can hold about half inch of water. 1 foot of clay can hold over 2 inches of water. So clay holds a lot more water than sand does, but all of them hold water. Just clay soils hold more water than sandy soils. Now, to get the air in, since sand and silt are relatively round, if you know physics or geometry, round spheres, solid round spheres put together in a container, the solid spheres will be amounts to 66% of volume. The space between the spheres 33% of volume. So if you just had sand or silt as a soil, you can say the airspace in there is 33% of the volume. And it turns out the bigger the spaces between the particles, the more the air can flow through it. The size of the spaces has a lot to do with airflow. There's less friction if the spaces are bigger. So, and the amount, the ability to pass air through the soil is its permeability. So that's how well the soil can breathe. So sand, a very sandy soil is highly permeable. Gravel's even more permeable. You know, a pile of rocks here just blows right through it. Um, Clay actually has a lot of air spaces too, but they're tiny. So the air has a hard time getting through clay, especially if it's surrounded by water. Then there's hardly any air spaces left once the water fills all the gaps. And clay, the ability to hold water is the porosity. And you see this used backwards all the time. A lot of people say, well, use clay pots, they're more porous, so they breathe better. That's not why they're called porous. They're porous because they hold water really well. They'll absorb the water. They'll absorb the water anyway and attaches to the clay particles. Clay is more permeable than plastic. So air can go through a clay pot better than it can through plastic, but certainly not nearly as well as sand does. So if you have a soil that's filled with sand and silt, the air goes through there very well. But if you add too much clay to it, it blocks up all the air space that's in there, and the soil no longer breathes. Well, we know that sand and silt are 66% of the volume. So there's 33% left where the air flows through. You've got soil that's over 33% clay, no more air spaces. So it doesn't take much clay to make a clay type soil. Just, about 35% clay, you're blocked up. The air has a lot harder time getting through there. So here we've got in Orange County, these hills behind us are called sandy clay. A little too much clay. They got a lot of sand, but a little too much clay to breathe. Uh, um, you can still grow plants well on it because of the drainage that the hill provides, but it is sandy clay up there. The rivers bring that soil down. Now, sand's the heaviest particle in the rivers, so below the hills, the first particles that fall out are sand. So this area here, there's a lot of sand. To uh, Close to the hills in Irvine and Tustin. Then you go to and then Anaheim, Winter Park, Garden Grove, lots of sandy soil there. But as you go toward the ocean, the rivers slow down and then the clay comes out. So you've got Los Alamitos, Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa. Most of those areas are clay unless they're right next to the river where sand's still being deposited. But or what's deposited last. They're all putting close in concrete now, so it doesn't happen anymore. But those areas tend to be more clay toward the ocean. So what makes a good soil? Um, so this sandy loam, which is found right here, so it's got all the soil particles in it, but hardly any clay. The sand content is about this. This sample is about 80%, and the clay is only about 8%. So that leaves what 12% for silt. Now, one way to check that, and that's what we did here, we took a clear bottle, like this is a mayonnaise jar, and we filled it half with this soil. Add water to the neck. It used to be higher. I mean, we've used the same bottle for the last 15 years, so water's evaporating slowly. And then add a few drops of soap to it. Shake it up really, really well so all the particles are broken down into the smallest particles possible. Then set it on your counter. The sand just falls out. Sand can't float in water very well, so it just falls out. The silt comes down next. Smaller particles are a little more buoyant, and then the clay just sits in the water all night. It's like a milky substance, and it finally settles by morning. And on this sample here, it's less than a quarter inch of clay at the surface. And then most of this is sand. Then you can see the silt in between the two. So it's a rough guesstimate. I mean, we've seen soils though that for this more clay, the clay layer is like that thick in the morning. It's just this goo on top. So you can kind of see roughly what your soil is with that jar method.
You said you put soap in there?
2 drops of dish soap, yeah, it helps break up all the pieces. Sometimes, first time we shook it up, it didn't separate as well. It's like you do it a couple days in a row and you get the pieces more separated. They don't stick together as well. And then you get a better reading on it. But sandy loam, let's turn the page. Um, a good sandy loam is usually around 60%, 30, 10. This is a lot more sand than normal, but still considered sandy loam. And then a regular, what they call a rich loam. So the term rich soils 150 years ago meant it had enough clay in it. The rich loam would be more or less 20% clay, maybe 40 and 40, something like that. I mean, the numbers can go up and down by about 10 points in all directions. I mean, the geologists have mapped California pretty well, so you can give them a sample soil and then look at the ratios of these numbers and what color it is and all that. They can tell you where that sample soil came from. They kind of cataloged all of Orange County, so they can tell you where the soil came from. But a rich loam would have enough clay to make it hold more water, but still not allow air to go through there. Um, that'd be a loam. Then a clay loam would be anything over, it can be 40% there, 40 and 20, something like that. Once you block the airflow, then they call it a clay soil. Now, 150 years ago, this is what the farmers wanted. So you look at some old movies, they'll tell you, well, he got the rich soil down by the riverbed, and this farmers are using the poor soil on the side of the hill because they were sitting in decomposed granite or a little sandy soil on the hill, and by the riverbed they were in the clay loam. Back in the 1800s, that was what farmers wanted. They wanted that clay soil because after the rain stopped, they didn't have irrigation tool, equipment, so they wanted stuff that just stayed wet. That was most important to them, was just being wet. So that's why they farmed in Los Alamitos, Fountain Valley before World War II, because they didn't have irrigation. They said, well, this soil stays wet till summer. Whereas this stuff, dry in a week after the rain stops. They couldn't grow a crop in that. And that was so sandy soil is considered the poor soil, and clay soil is considered the rich soil. Well, there's nothing really wrong with clay. Plants do grow a little slower when there's less air exchange. They grow a little slower. But now this stuff is lethal if you mix it with compost. And the problem with their industry is that all the growers were told, starting about 40 years ago, you can't grow plants in this. You got to grow them in compost. Round up dead wood, dead trees, because there's no nutrition in this. Is what they've been told. So they have everybody growing on this. Well, if the plant is very sensitive to that, as that stuff, you know, for compost, the definition, it's been decomposing. And to do that, it's either bacteria or fungi or both. So there's in a good compost, there are disease organisms in here. Their job is to take the plant material and break it down into simpler parts, take the nutrition out of it as they go, which is the energy that's stored in the wood and stuff like that. Um, so this is loaded with disease organisms. You grow plants in there, if it's sensitive, it just rots. You put compost, so to decompose properly, you've been told you make a compost pile, you keep turning that because if you need the oxygen there to make this decompose without creating sewer gas, you just make a hole in the ground and drop this in there, it goes septic, it goes sewer on you. So in landfills, when they cover that stuff up, they get methane gas, they got to vent it out or else they get explosions. Um, all these sewer gases being formed when you bury the compost. So that's the problem we're having right now in the clay. Clay doesn't breathe well enough. You put a plant in compost in the clay, it rots. This stuff is going septic in the ground. Um, and they keep telling us, oh, you improve clay by adding compost to it. And it makes it, and I've also read, if you add compost to your soil and make it turn rich and black, the black is from sewer gas. That's what makes it black. When you add compost to soil and it turns black, you've just killed your soil. A lot of plants will not grow in that anymore. These plants, a lot of these plants can tolerate it, but you've just wiped it out. Any chance of growing this up on this side. So that's our main problem is that it's been since the 80s that the growers have been told, and I've been told to my face, you can't grow plants in dirt. You got to grow. So I'm old enough. My dad grew all his plants in this soil. And I know it because I played it when I was a kid. We had a big dirt pile. My brothers and I all got in there, made cities and roads and things. This is the texture we remember. But by the 60s, the problem in the industry was you have a five, in those days, 5 gallon containers were actually 5 gallon containers. They weren't 3.5 like they are today. And you filled this in a 5 gallon bucket, it's like 50 pounds of soil. No one can lift anything. So the industry was told you've got to make your soil lighter. So the university told them, well, you can go half sand and half peat. So peat moss is very, very light. So a mixture of sand and peat would take it to about half the weight of sand. Now we know Cal State Fullerton still uses that mix today with good success. At least the last I heard, they still use sand and peat half and half. But peat moss has always been expensive, and the coconut core people tell you, oh, this is non-sustainable. Like, huh? Coconut core comes from the island of Sri Lanka. There's not many coconut palms on Sri Lanka compared to how many peat bogs there are all around the northern hemisphere. Siberia, northern Europe, Canada, northern United States. Some parts of South America are peat bogs. There's, I don't know, it's non-sustainable. Those dying reeds and those peat bogs keep making peat moss. There's a lot of peat moss. Like one of the biggest peat moss suppliers in the U.S., they just have one lake in Canada. That's all they've ever been harvesting. One lake in Canada, dry it up, vacuum clean the peat moss off the surface, and then let the water go back. Next year they do the same thing. They keep vacuuming the peat. Now peat doesn't have the same reaction as compost because most of the plants in a peat bog aren't related to anything we're growing. Plus, this stuff's been dead for 1,000 years or more. So there's no disease reaction with peat. It still decomposes at a real slow rate, but it doesn't have a disease reaction with plants. So that was fine. But peat has always been expensive, so the nurses wanted something even cheaper. So the universities told them, well, we'll go 1/3 sand, 1/3 peat, 1/3 bark. Bark is cheaper, more accessible than peat. Plus, it's still very light. So that was in use for number of years. Um, but then the growers uh, asks the universities, what's the fastest way to grow plants in the pot? And they told them, well, pure bark. So when bark is fresh, well, they have to let this decompose for most things when you first kill them. How unnatural is this in the first place? So I mean, if you see a tree fall over in the forest dead, stuff doesn't decompose for sometimes centuries. An intact tree takes forever to decompose. It's a very slow process, but here they grind it into a million pieces, and the whole tree can decompose to nothing in 6 months. What's natural about that? That's not very natural. So it decomposes so quickly when you first grind this stuff up, they have to let it sit in a pile and get the heat out of it because this stuff heats up. It can catch on fire. So the decomposition is so quick when you first chop these things up, and then it slows down. It's still decomposing, but it slows down so they can at that point use it as a growing medium. But see the should go back. So one of the things that make a plant grow fast is the most access to water, the most access to oxygen, and nice even temperatures in that temperature range. So if you can provide the roots with all those things, lots of water, lots of oxygen, and an even temperature, you're going to get your best growth possible. I mean, more of each, more water and more oxygen. Well, bark doesn't hold a whole lot of water when it's fresh, but the plants too, when there's growing plants here, the plants they put in are quite small, so their water usage isn't that much, and this can usually hold enough water to make it through the next irrigation cycle. But boy, is it airy. This has got a lot of airspace when it's fresh. So the plants just haul on this stuff. But the research has told the growers, after about 5 months, this stuff is decomposed down so far that the airflow starts being compromised. And as it decomposes, it starts holding on to more and more water. So within 8 months, it becomes a lethal medium. So they said within 5 months, you got to make sure that you either sell your plant or you put in a pile with fresh bark or you discard it because it won't live in this much longer. So that's what we get these days. We get plants that can sit in a pot for 3, 4, 5 months and then they just decline. It's like, okay, plant person buys this stuff, puts in the ground house. But they expect, well, if you put this stuff in sandy soil, sandy soil like that, sandy soil like this stuff tends not to go septic when it's surrounded by air. In that plastic pot, it can get real septic in there because the plastic pot doesn't breathe. There's not much airflow in that pot anymore. But if it's surrounded by very airy soil, it can make it. Especially plants on this side, they can make it, even if they're in this. But you put them in clay, it rots. So the nurseries think this turns into air, which it's supposed to. When things decompose totally, they become carbon dioxide and water. But in heavy soils, it just becomes a little area of a bog, like peat bog. It doesn't breathe. It's just rot in here. Yes.
So, sounds to me like the fir bark is great for commercial growers who are turning over their plants and selling them to the typical consumer at home who is going to keep that plant in the ground or in a pot.
Right.
It's just a time bomb ticking.
Right. Right. So most potting soils that are made, fir bark is the main ingredient. Um, so yeah, well, okay, this is what we're told. So I went to a seminar at UCLA. The researcher told us that potting soils in the U.S. are meant to last 5 months because if you're in New Jersey or Mississippi or Montana, any place like that, other than Southern California, you plant your plants in a pot in the spring. 5 months later, they're frozen to death in November. You don't need the soil to last that long. You don't need the plants to live that long because in a pot, there's no way to get through winter unless you have them either in a greenhouse or something like that. So most potting soils, yes, well, all potting soils except for ours are meant to last less than a year. 5 months. They told us was their goal, 5 months.
You have plants that are already in the ground and they're planted with whatever was in
Compost, right?
yeah. And then the plants start to wither. What's the solution? Dig them up and replant them?
That's one of the ways you can do it. Now, next week it's going to be all about that, fixing the plants. Today we're just talking about what's the best soil and why. But yeah, that is a problem that we've dealt with in the past now since we figured this out. We figured this out 30 years ago that this was lethal to the plants. Apparently, no one else has. So what's wrong with their industry? So one of the things that the other advantage we have is we've always been a grower. My dad, in the old days, all the nurseries were grower retailers. We grew the plants we sold to customers, and if we heard a problem, we tried to fix it. Nowadays, it's a whole different operation. There's wholesale growers and there's retail nurseries or garden centers, and there's no connection. The wholesale growers know that this stuff grows their plants just fine. And if the homeowner kills it, they said, you overwatered it. It rotted because you overwatered it. Whereas, it's like there's no connection between the grower and the user anymore, like there used to be.
It's almost like built-in obsolescence in cars. It means you'll have to come back next year and buy another plant.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, azaleas and camellias, and I grew up in San Gabriel Valley, they were just flourished. They
Right.
did real well. I've got a bunch of them planting now, they're just withering away.
Right. So, up until the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s, that's when they changed all the soil mixes. We lost our last decent supplier in about 2006. The sales rep came to us and said, my dad changed the soil. He's using more bark now because it's cheaper and lighter. And I can't change his mind. Because, again, the universities have recommended this mix to all the growers. So everyone considers the universities to be where the knowledge should be, that they know more than nurserymen do, but like, I don't think so. It's almost like any other thing out there now, medicine, history. It's like the academia have locked us in on certain concepts and they won't let us look at alternatives like they should. So, which is interesting that agriculture is different than horticulture. Agriculture, they know exactly what's right. They know this is the best soil. Horticulture, they think this is the best soil, and for some reason they can't get they're I don't know, they just don't see what each other's work is. It's like it's really weird. Um, so anyway, the more air, the more water you can get to a plant, the better. Uh, so there's nothing really wrong with clay if there's no compost in it. You can grow plants in it. When we moved, so I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley too, where all the nurseries actually started. All the big nurseries were in the San Gabriel Valley because that area was um, apparently it was a hotbed because it was supplying plants to both Beverly Hills and San Marino, where all the rich people lived in those days. So the nurseries were there, and they had great soil in the San Gabriel Valley. It's all real loose soil like this. I remember when I was a kid, my backyard, I can get a hand trowel and dig a hole 3 foot deep. Like it was just all really loose soil. Um, and all the big nurseries started there, Monrovia, Hines, you name it. All the big names started in the San Gabriel Valley. Everyone did really well until the 80s when the original owners retired and they hired people from the colleges. Ruined everything. Ruined everything. But those soils that were originally used were pretty much like what we sell now. It's what the soils used to be like. And then they went to bark when the owners got too old, which is one of the few reasons I'm still in business. And I work for myself because you put me in any other garden center, I wouldn't be able to sell the plants or the soil that they're recommending, anything. So it's strange.
So if you go to Home Depot and buy a bag of garden soil, is that mostly compost? Or
Yeah.
is that,
Yeah. Well, sometimes they'll put actual dirt in there, but it's loaded too much with compost. I mean, if it looks brown, it's not dirt. I mean, dirt is supposed to look like this, but everything they sell looks more brownish. It's too brown.
tell the difference by looking at one of your bags versus looking at other ones from Home Depot? Yours is much heavier because of the
Yeah, so
low scrap.
real soil is about 100 pounds per cubic foot. So, I mean, back in the 1990s, we started doing our own soil testing. We were, in the late 80s, it became apparent to us that there's something wrong with the plants. So before the late 80s, we were growing most of the plants we sold. But in the late 80s, I told, you know, I told my dad, it's much you can make more money by just buying them from the wholesale growers and selling them than you can by growing them yourself, which is stupid now, but that's what I thought. I thought this growing process takes too long. Just buy and sell, buy and sell. So we made a lot of money in the early 1990s because of that, but boy, we were having all kinds of problems with the plants. In fact, in the late 80s, my dad called the ag department and says, "Why are my plants rotting?" They told him, "Well, you can't water your plants every day." Now, what had happened is from the 1950s to the 1980s, late 80s, he watered all his plants every day. Never had a problem because plants don't rot when there's no compost in the soil. And suddenly in the late 80s, we're buying these plants from growers growing in compost and they're rotting on us. And the ag department, they didn't know enough either. The ag agents told them, "You can't water plants every day. You're going to rot them. Too much water." So we had to come up. So my dad told me, "You figure this out. I've been watering my plants every day for the last 30 years and suddenly it doesn't work. You figure out what's going on." So first of all, we figured out how to live with the plants in compost. Well, you had to let them dry out till the soil looked dry on the surface. If it looked dry on the surface, it was no longer saturated at the bottom, so the air can get in there and keep the roots alive. But still, people plant them at their house and they would rot out. It was just really frustrating. So, I'd have to have my employees go out there with the hose, drag the hose around every day, and only water the plants where the soil looked dry, which was a pain in the rear. Every plant we had was different. Get from different grower, dries out at a different rate. Like, how can you do this? How can homeowners do this? So finally, I met up with the soil scientist that was working for NASA for the space program. He says, "Your industry is stupid." Kind of now those words too. He says, "You don't know what you're doing." And he couldn't convince any nurseries that he was right. He says, "Plants don't grow in organic matter." And he was showing me what they're doing for the space shuttle. And I go, "Well, this kind of makes sense from what I grew up with." So we started doing our own experiments in the early 90s, just with growing plants in pure sand. We couldn't believe it. How much better they look than the potting soils we were selling at that time, which are mainly bark, um, just in pure sand. This absolutely gorgeous. The first plant we did was strawberries. So we were used to strawberries the potting source line at the time was Whitney Farms compost, real rich, all the minerals you need to grow plants. Strawberries in a pot this size with the Whitney Farms, the plants grew about 8 inches across. Strawberries as big as your thumb. And then we grew it in sand. They were suddenly 2 foot wide with huge berries on them. We're going, okay, there's something wrong. This stuff we're trying to sell people is absolutely poison compared to the sand. So we had to figure out how to make sand lighter or soil in general lighter because sand and soil are about the same. They're about 100 pounds per square foot, per cubic foot. Turns out what's interesting is the bigger the particle, the heavier it is. Um, so this is actually well, there's more sand in this jar. So the sand feels like it weighs a little more than that one does. Now, okay. So we asked some of the soil guys, what's the lightest version of quartz? So the space program, the guy had found this volcano in New Mexico that had the lightest weight volcanic rock I've ever seen. He says He was going to use this for the space shuttle, but because it floats, it's no good. You can't have things floating around the spacecraft. But you can take this volcanic rock from this volcano, put in your hands and blow, and it just floats in the air. It's so lightweight. It's very airy stuff. That's what he was using as containers. But in the space shuttle, they end up sending up spun glass, so woven glass threads, which again is silicon dioxide. So we go, okay, what's the lightest natural version of sand is pumice. Now, there's a lot of different pumices around, even around California. There's some heavier ones, some lighter ones. Pumice and perlite are are both silicon dioxide. This is man-made. This is volcanic made. You can get a perlite that's as heavy as pumice too. There are, of course, the perlites, but pumice is the natural thing that is the lightest version of silicon dioxide. So we went with pumice. Straight pumice weighs about 1/3 as much as, well, 40% as much as sand does. So it's still quite heavy. And we found that it does dry out kind of fast. Um, it wouldn't survive one day of 80 degrees without being watered again. So we said, okay, what holds water the best? It's light. So the people at UC Riverside told us it's peat moss. Peat moss is the one thing in nature that holds water better, or supplies water better. Let's put it that way, because clay holds water better than peat, but clay will not let it go. Clay, the water just sticks to the clay. It's hard for plants to get water off of clay unless it's really, really wet. Peat will allow all the water to be taken off its surface. So it's the best way to hold water. Plus, if you had a container full of pumice and you drip some water on it, it just goes straight through. Peat moss has a nice wicking quality to it. If you mix pumice and peat, the water is wicked throughout the medium, we call it, the soil. So we tried that combination first in the early 90s, and lo and behold, everything grew really well on it, really well. So we made that soil first. We said, well, it's not a lot of peat, so the peat's got to be on the low side. We called it our mix, and that the name kind of stuck. We were going to change it. Our customers said, no, we're used to that name. We want to know we got the same product. So we keep selling it as our acid mix, just half peat moss and half pumice, the two extremes. Holds air really well. They said pure pumice, 70% air. Peat moss holds a lot of water. Put them together, and you get a good growing medium that grows just about anything. The pH is high fives or low sixes. But with half peat, the peat does, it is so small, the soil settles over time. Plus, if you have peat moss on the surface, you water it, it kind of blows off. You're losing your peat moss. So, and the peat does decompose slowly too over a 5-year period. So the soil filled with this acid mix does shrink a bit over a year, by maybe 15%, 12, 15%. We said, well, we need something a little more stable. So we started adding more components to this mixture. And we settled over a period of 20 years, we settled over on our top pot mix, which is, let's write it down. There's nothing magical about it. We've changed that formula many, many times over the years, but we've kind of settled this on a compromise of weight and water retention. So it's 35% peat moss, 30% humus, 20% perlite, 10% sand. Our bagging company told us with this type of bag material, you can't go much more than about 10% sand. It's going to be too heavy to lift it without your fingers poking a hole through the bag. So they told us don't get much higher than 10% sand on it. 5% charcoal. The charcoal is an inert form of organic matter. Um, and this is what makes the rich soils of the world both rich and black. So if you're near a volcano, if you're near where an old campfire was, um, the soils are often real black because of a like uh, National Geographic ran on a soil article near 2000, and he said the rich black soils of the world are 1 to 2% charcoal by volume. It's not much, but it makes the soil look very dark. And charcoal is used as a filter because everything's attracted to charcoal. Minerals just attract to it. So in nature, charcoal is how you store minerals in soil without them just running through the soil. So the rich black soils of the world are rich and black because of a very low charcoal content. So we overdid it. In fact, charcoal is real expensive. I could have made it a little cheaper if we lowered the charcoal by about half of that. So there's charcoal in there. That mix, we our target plant was gardenia because gardenias have a reputation of being really difficult. So we had a gardenia plant in a 2-gallon bucket, twice as big as this. It grew like 4 foot tall in a couple of years. We had them there for 3 years to go. Okay, this plant really likes this soil mix we made. So we settled on that mixture, and we're using it to this date. But in the past, it has been different. And when we make our bulk soil for our own use, our local company can't source or doesn't want to source charcoal, so we just add a little more sand to it. In the past, we've used up to 20% sand. That's
So obviously, maybe not obviously, the pH in your top and your acid is a little bit different.
not much. Because most of these particles are neutral. The peat moss has the acidity. Pumice might, from the California source, might be a little bit alkaline, but sand is kind of neutral. Perlite's neutral, so they don't really have. Um, they're both acidic. I mean, we've grown blueberries. We'd rather grow them in the 50% peat, but we've grown blueberries in 20% peat, and they've still done fine. So it still is an acidic. I don't know the pH of this is probably in the sixes somewhere.
But if you're going to find a camellia, for instance, you're going to do the acidic.
No, we've used the top pot when we grow them here. Camellias aren't that sensitive. I mean, there's a lot of abandoned camellias living in Pasadena and Altadena. It is. They seem to just do okay. I mean, in theory, the pH is most important when using chemical fertilizers. When plants get their fertilizers organically, the pH is not involved. So that's more important when using chemicals because certain chemical fertilizers dissolve at certain pHs, but most plants don't use that system. In fact, we should talk about that now. Anyway, this is the setup we have in our top pot. Um, it's not a magic formula. You can change all these numbers by quite a bit. In fact, again, pure sand. I've got a fruit tree out in the back here that's been in a pot in pure sand for 25 years. It's been in there a long time, since the late mid-90s. So sandwoods here. So the history of potting soil. Back in the 1800s, they started growing citrus in big containers in France. They invented greenhouses at that time too. And in the 1920s, somebody analyzed what was in those big pots of citrus. 98% sand is what they used. So sand was the original potting soil. My dad's bonsai book, in China and Japan, they've been growing plants in little tiny pots for thousands of years now. and they said, well, we don't want to use sand because we know sand grows the most vigorous plants. And for bonsai, we want non-vigorous stunted plants with small leaves. So they would add loam with clay in it to slow down the root health, root vigor. But the books do mention if you have trouble with root rot in these real shallow pots, get it out there, put it in pure sand till it recovers. So they knew about soil. I mean, my dad's bonsai, the teachers knew about soil being sand, silt, and clay. But for some reason, in the United States, we went to this ground up wood stuff. Um, so even in the 1920s, the World Horticultural Society said that loam was the best soil for containers. And it's just in the 60s and 70s and beyond that it was changed because of a different question. How do you grow plants the fastest in a pot to sell to the public? It's not the same as how do you grow plants in a pot.
When you refer to sand, is it beach sand or is it sand that you buy play sand at Home Depot or?
Well, the sand at at any hardware store would work or any building supply place. They take that out of the river. It's the sand at the beach. If you start hauling sand from the beach, they'll arrest you. Um, Plus, it's very salty. It takes a lot of water to get that salt out of there.
So if you, this construction sand.
Right. Any kind of sand out. We've used clay sand, plaster sand, concrete sand, wash sand. They claim that mortar sand might be too fine, but still, it's coarser than silver clay, which should still work.
So you can use that to help fill up more bulk, like a garden box or something.
Oh yeah, works real good.
The island nation of Japan,
Mhm.
their soil would tend to be more sandy and volcanic. Anyway,
I don't know. It's a pretty big place. It's big as California, so you have a lot of clay there too. I mean, they have the rice paddies. Um, let's see. Off my train of thought here. So in Europe, they do a lot of container growing, especially in the Netherlands. Netherlands, all hothouse growing. They grow crops for all of Europe, whether it be flowers, vegetables, everything is grown in containers and hothouses. So they've been promoting certain things for use in hothouses for a long time. And I used to get a magazine journal that was translated in English from the Netherlands talking about the hothouse materials for container things. And they would use sand, they'd use pumice, they use perlite, vermiculite, um, clay pellets, which are interesting. This is clay fired into beads, so you get the both worlds. It holds water, holds nutrients pretty well, but there's airspace between the clay. So those are all standard in history. They also use the rock wools, which are just minerals that are, what do you call it, woven into strands so the air goes through there. And they also use foam plastic. So foam plastic, like a sponge, uh, does everything that you need now. Could be there first, and could be that. So those are the mineral type things that they recommend for use as growing medium. Now, what do you know about container growing? In Europe, they use a lot of what are called Dutch, can't remember the term now, Dutch box. Well, they use containers about this big. Now, they're made out of plastic. The problem with plastic, because it's not porous, it doesn't absorb any of the excess water. So if you grow a plant in the ground is like a series of sponges. So you have a sponge on top of a sponge on top of a sponge, and the water just transfers all the way down as far as it can go. The soil is just sucking up the extra moisture. But in a pot, there's no sponge below it. There's holes in the pot, but the sponge holds a lot of water uh, according to how dense the material is. They'll have a higher water table. So this is called a perch. So in containers, you get a perch water table. In the ground, it can happen too. Like in Laguna, they had that, what was it, the Bluebird Canyon slide in the 1980s because they had clay soil that's sitting on top of sandy soil. So clay has a high affinity to water, sand doesn't. So what happened is the water would all collect in the clay layer above the sand, and it would get real slick underneath that clay layer, and that clay layer just slid off the sand. because the sand wasn't absorbing the extra water. It's coarser, doesn't absorb it as well as the clay does. So that's the perched water table in that regard, and that caused a lot of problems down there. So in a pot, you have a perched water table. The coarser the material, the lower the water table, the finer the texture. So if this was filled with clay, the water would just sit totally saturated soil is when there's no air spaces left in the soil medium. The water is being held as much as it can, and often when it's saturated, there's no more air spaces in there. It looks shiny. To us, it looks shiny. So if this was filled with clay, the water would be all the way to the top. You couldn't grow a plant of that. There's no air circulation in that clay, and the roots would eventually, well, they wouldn't develop deep at all. They wouldn't kill them, but they would just develop on the surface of this clay. So in a container situation, you need a coarser soil so that the air can go further through it, and the perched water table not too high. So potting soils in general have to be coarser soils than the soils you put in the ground. So in the ground, in a raised bed in the ground, you can put sandy loam in there. In a container, if you put sandy loam in there, you'll have a perched water table. This sandy loam, which my dad used, is very sandy, but you still get a perched water table about 2 or 3 inches high, which is quite high. I mean, the first time we started making our own soil first thing we were doing, we were growing roses back in the 90s. We made it 40% sandy loam, which was a big mistake. So the water sat in those containers all day. You get water. It's a little pond in there all day. There's this water sitting in the pot. The roses looked great. They didn't have any problem with that water sitting there around their roots because there's no compost in the water, so they were fine with it. We're just going, okay, we got to lower the amount of loam in there because there's too much clay in the loam for that water to drain out of that pot very fast and to sit there for hours and hours and hours. But the plants weren't bothered that much. But again, if you want a faster growing plant, you got to have more air on the roots. So that's why they use these materials that are more airy than the real dirt is. Now on the organic side, peat moss does work for a while. Fresh peat doesn't hold, well, it's got some air spaces in it while the peat is still fairly freshly dug. And we can get a good plant growth in here for about 6 to 8 months. So for most crops, short crops, plenty of time. You can grow a tomato in here or anything that's 3 or 4 months of growth. It'll work in pure peat. Now there are different grades of peat. So if you get a low grade of peat, sometimes you got to add a little bit of perlite to make up for the lack of airspace in your peat. So there are some really good potting tools out there, especially made for growing marijuana. Peat perlite, 80% peat, 20% perlite, around that mix. Sometimes it's 12%, 18% perlite, 82% peat. It's a real popular mix. Fox Farm, Sun Grow, they make that as a premium potting soil. But again, with that much peat moss there, it's not good for more than about a year. Year is about it. We had the Sun Grow rep tell us, this was back in the 80s, no, the mid 90s. He told me that I couldn't make a potting soil better than his Sun Grow stuff. I said, okay, this has got to be a 2-year test. Got to be a 2-year test. So he took one of the hardest plants to grow. It was Hamboticaba, which is a real sensitive fruit tree to compost and soil mix. And it needs a lot of air around the roots. So I said, this has got to be a 2-year test. So he took these small Hamboticabas, put them in a 5-gallon bucket full of his soil and our soil at the time. I think we were just using the acid mix. And after 1 year, he came back and the plants looked identical. 1 year growth in 80% peat and 50% peat, like we had. It was fine. Said, okay, you got to come back next year. And after the 2nd year, his plant was the same size it was the 1st year. Our plant had grown twice as big because his soil had lost all its airspace by the 2nd year. Not enough permanent material in that 80% peat moss. So that's the best potting soils in the market are 80% peat, 20% perlite. The rest of them are made out of bark, which is only good for a few months. So anyway, farms in the Netherlands said that they can use peat. They know what it does. They can use rice hulls. Now, rice hulls, the hulls of rice, there's plenty of them. In the processing of rice, you get all these rice hulls as a byproduct. Well, rice hulls are about 90% silica, so they don't decompose well at all. They said rice hulls essentially don't decompose. Some of the other stuff that gets mixed in with the rice hulls might decompose, but the rice hulls themselves just don't decompose. They said you go up to the levees in near Sacramento where they put the extra rice hulls. They put them in the levees. You reach in a levee that was 50 years old and pull out a handful of rice hulls, look fresh. They don't decompose. But anyway, rice hulls act a lot like perlite does. So they said this is good material for growing hothouse plants in too. And then they said they spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to figure out how to use used wood, because Europe invented the transportation system of pallets and forklifts. They developed that system that we all use nowadays. It's real efficient. Pallets and forklifts. Well, they have all this old wood that they have to get rid of. They said, well, why don't we grind this wood up and see if we can use it as a growing medium? They said, we tried. The problem with wood is that one piece of wood is not uniform. The decomposing properties of wood, one part of a piece of wood may decompose in 3 months. One part of wood may not decompose for 2 years. They can't grind it up and make uniform material out of wood. They can do it out of peat. They can do it out of coconut husks, but they can't do it out of wood or bark. They tried bark too because there's a lot of bark around the sawmills. They have a lot of bark laying there. They said both wood and bark are not uniform enough to make a growing medium out, but that's what they use in the U.S. Grow plants in wood and bark. Yes.
Say that they take coffee grounds and eggshells and add to their soil. I mean, are there characteristics of those items that make it fairly?
Well, it's nutrition. So all this organic matter is great for nutrition, not so good for as a growing medium. So I didn't talk about that yet. I missed the part. So in nature, the way that 95% of plants get their nutrition is not from the soil itself. So you got a plant sitting up here. The roots are in the sand, so the clay down there. Um, there's a lot of dead stuff on the top of the ground. The average around the world, they claim is 5 inches. We know in the deserts it might be less than an inch. In some rainforests, it can be 5 foot deep dead leaves, but the average is about 5 inches of dead stuff on top of the ground. And that's where all the nutrition for plants is stored. The dead leaves falling around. The leaves have everything the tree needs to grow new leaves. So the nutrition from the dead leaves gets to the roots. The way it happens, most plants, and they just discovered this 50, 60 years ago, in nature there's a symbiotic partner called a mycorrhizal fungus that is attached to the roots of most plants. Not all plants, but the majority of plants, 95% of all plant species, have a fungus attached to roots, and they thought that this fungus was a part of the plant's root system because they couldn't tell the difference until they had electron microscope and they look at this stuff on the roots and they go, "This isn't a plant. This is a fungus." So they found out that on woody trees, a lot of woody trees, 80% of the roots of this tree that they thought were the roots of the tree is actually this fungus that's attached to the roots. So this fungus does this. It goes up into the dead leaves and eats them up and transfers nutrients back to the tree. Now, there are some plants that work with bacteria. Uh, So a lot of the plant, well, the one family of plants that's well known is, um, the cabbage family, Brassicaceae. Those plants evolved, they're recently evolved plants that the root system are so good they can pull nutrients out of what native soil is there. So they have the ability to do that. They're considered the pioneer plants. Grasses are that way too. So a lot of grasses are relatively highly evolved, newly evolved plants that have incredible root systems that can gather the minerals that they need to create themselves. But once they die and form a layer of dead stuff on the ground, the woody plants with the mycorrhizal fungus lock that system up. All the nutrients are in the dead leaves or in the plants themselves. There's very little left in the soil. So if you go into a forest, mineralized soil, there's no nutritional value there. It's all locked up either in the dead leaves on the ground or in the tree itself. There's very little left in the soil. They go into rainforests, they notice that rainforest soil is almost sterile. There's no nutrition at all. It's all in the plants and the dead stuff on the ground. The soil there, in order to get the soil more nutritious, they got to burn that forest down to get that all the nutrients back free again in order to grow some certain crops. Of course, all you have to do is kill the plants and let them leave them on the ground, and the system works. Mycorrhizal fungus works. They said it's faster than bacteria, so you make compost piles. That's bacterial decomposition, which is slower. It's faster just to let the fungus at it. So just let the leave the leaves on the ground, and everything is fine. So that's how most of nature works. Is this fungus in the plant's roots gather the nutrients from the dead leaves. The University of California, Davis went around the Central Valley 30, 40 years ago and this surveyed the plants and the soil to see how the different types of soil influence what plants grew. They said had no influence. They said the same plants grew over any kind of soil. Could have been alkaline, could have been acidic, could have had a lot of boron in it, a lot of iron in this soil. Didn't matter. The same plants grew because the plants weren't using the soil as a nutrition source. They were using the dead leaves that are piled around them. That was their conclusion. The plants they were surveying were not using the soil for nutritional purposes. So that's why we don't put any fertilizer on these, because that's not the role of the soil. Whereas everybody else thinks the soil has to be the nutrition. And you buy any potting soil that says, this soil is highly nutritious. Recycle dead plants. We don't know of any plant that can eat fir bark. Like, okay, how does that work? They can't eat the fir bark. So now we also, so those are the materials that you can use for growing plants. And now we've seen a lot of research reports on making potting soil. So one of the problems that the potting soils are so bad is the plants they use to check the potting soil. So when we saw the test by University of California this is back in the 80s, they were determining which potting soils were the best. Their test plant was tomatoes. So they said, okay, the potting soil with the fir bark grew the best looking tomato plants versus some of the other potting soils on the market. The tomato plants are growing in a compost pile. It's the only plant we know of that can grow in a compost pile. Over at Orange County Farm Supply, they did a test where they grew this in a bag of manure. It'll grow in a bag of manure. Tomato plants' roots are really strong. They can adapt to really bad conditions. Our bulk soil coming in locally, they said, well, you're making this really expensive soil. We want to check it out with tomato plants. Going, that's not how you check soil. If you want to check the soil, grow a strawberry. And if you grow a nice looking strawberry in there, or grow lavender will grow in it, then you've got good soil. But they won't use the hard plants. In fact, one of these crazy tests. So the UCLA professor, we went to the potting soil. He was making it out of the bark of palm trees or the wood of a palm tree. says this stuff lasts a good long, 6 to 8 months. His test plants were the original test. They were checking all the local potting soils or the national brands. They're using ferns, cyclamen, and patience. I can't remember the fourth one. And the only plants that survived at all were the impatiens. Everything else died in all the soils. It's like, didn't they get it? That none of these potting soils can grow ferns or cyclamen. They can grow the impatiens because the impatiens tolerate them all. So they used the impatiens as their test plant. Whichever soil the impatiens grew best in was their best soil, and it happened to be that. Of course, the guy made it so his palm stuff worked the best.
Right.
They always have to skew the results to make sure that their product works better, to make sure that they spent the grant money the right way. So, but all the other plants were dead. It's like, what's wrong with these people? Why don't they get it? I was too chicken in those days to question the guy back in the 90s. I didn't want to question this professor about his testing, the way he was testing it's like everything dies. How could any of this be any good? Okay. Any questions? Now, just so you know, this stuff is used in hydroponics. Everything that is in hydroponics is similar to how it operates in real dirt. Because some people say, well, hydroponics, it's a different world because you can water as much as you want. Well, hydroponics follows the same rules that we do. The system is really delicate because it doesn't hold that much water. But it maximizes the airflow. So these plants, because hothouse spaces are real expensive to use, so the plants got to grow at maximum speed and be maximum productive. So they give the roots maximum oxygen. So those plants grow the most vigorously. But when you have maximum oxygen, you have less amounts of water retention. So they have to water these things every few hours or at least several times a day to keep them alive. So the system is more delicate. Plus, they're pumping water through there all the time, and the water itself can have problems. If you don't watch your water quality, if the water gets too warm, warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. So they have to watch the temperature of the water that they're running through the system. If the water gets like 80 degrees, they can suffocate the plants. The 80-degree water doesn't hold much oxygen. Plus, if they get too much algae growing in the water, then the dead algae takes out the oxygen too, and they get no oxygen in their hydroponics, and they can run into trouble.
So, based on everything you presented to, you are also recommending compost for the top of the plants because the roots spread out and they need nutrition, right? I mean, as it gets into the summer, obviously it gets a lot hotter, and then compost tends to
insulate the soil.
So that applies to the top 5 inches as opposed to what the plant's actually sitting.
Right. So the roots are in the mineral soil down here. The fungus is in the bacteria up here. Mushrooms, earthworms, things like that live in that zone. The roots live in this zone and try to keep them separate. That's the thing. But this is important too. So we know from the 80s that the organic matter is an important part of the soil. Now, what's confused everybody is what the farmers have to do. So farmers, and this is often a farm in Irvine, they put organic matter over their farms every year, but they can't let it sit there because the wind just blows it away. So they have to till it in. But they have a limit. They know that they can't do more than about 5 cubic yards of organic matter per acre of dirt because then they'll get root rot. 5 yards of organic matter per acre of ground is not much.
Yeah,
it's like
top feeder roots, correct?
Well, the mycorrhizal fungus.
They're spreading out at the top of the
Well, a lot of that is mycorrhizal fungus. I mean, the Brassicaceae, look at a lot of grasses, that's their roots up there, but and most plants, it's the fungus that's up in there. So, so the farmers have to till it in order to keep the organic matter around, but they know they can't put too much down. Now there are farms that don't use tractors, so the farms use tractors. They have no choice. They till it in. But there's a lot of smaller farms that just put a lot of compost or dead stuff on top of the ground. Like I listened to 20 years ago, I listened to this farm up in the state of Washington. They said that around their orchards, they pile it up 18 inches thick. It's stuff from the local tree trimmers. They just chop up the trees, leaves, branches, everything, pile on the farm 18 inches deep. Their row crops 12 inches deep, 12 inches of, it's coarse enough the air gets through that. So it's no problem with the soil. The air gets through this coarse material, which is more like nature. They don't chop the leaves into a million pieces before they put them on the ground. That's the problem with a lot of these composts you buy. They're too fine. You can't go very deep with this stuff. The air doesn't get through that too well. It's better if it's a mix of branches and leaves, intact leaves, all that stuff. The air gets through there better. But yeah, they piled on the row crops. They said 12 inches deep. Of course, they have to move that mulch aside to plant their vegetables. So they grow their vegetables pretty tall before they put them in there, and then they put the mulch back. They said they don't have to fertilize, but they do mention they have chickens on the property, and they don't have to water. They said the thick mulch generates enough moisture at night from condensation that they've stopped watering. They said they had to water them before they put the mulches down. They've not had to water since. But this is in the peninsula up in Washington where it is more humid than here. And the nights down definitely are cooler than here too. But they said they got that idea because they'd walk into the forest in the morning and everything, all that leaf litter on the ground is just soggy wet. It's just the way it is there. But same thing, we saw that same thing happen in Texas during that drought they had in the 80s. We read this thing where they were all the plants were dead along the sides of the highways. The crews was going on the highways, grinding the plants up and putting the pile on one side of the road. They said what's really interesting, that pile, that side of the road, everything greened up next to that pile of dead stuff. Because Texas is very humid. So even though it was dry, it was humid, and that was creating moisture for the plants along that side of the road. So it does help with retain moisture. It does help with weed control. Insulating the ground does all kinds of things. Um, we'll talk about that more in the next few weeks. Um, so if plants are in bad soil, some of the symptoms you'll see. So this plant was in bad soil before we fixed. So we actually took this plant out of bad soil and put it in ours. So mahonias used to be a real common plant in the trade before the 1990s. And then after the 1990s, most nurseries stopped carrying them because all the plants we get this really ugly tip burn. Same with maple trees. You get a Japanese maple tree that's great in spring, all the leaves tip burn on you by summer. That means the roots are not happy. So when we got this plant, it was tip burning like crazy. So he took all its soil off, put it in our top pot, which is what's in the spot here. The new growth that came out last year was this. It's got more new growth now. It looks real fine. But yeah, the mahoney is just about disappeared from the trade because of the soil that we switched to. So a lot of plants that happened to, a lot of the plants that we used to grow back in the 70s and 80s are gone because they can't handle the compost that they're growing in. But that is a sign of problems is brown tip leaves, small leaves also. If you have big leaves that have brown tips, that's a salt burn, not enough water, or something like that. But the leaves are small, off color, brown tip. That usually means they don't have much root. I mean, so what we do at our store, and we'll do this demonstrate next week, is we take a lot of the plants we get from growers, because a lot of things we grow ourselves. Um, just as a note, we get a lot of plants in containers this size from the propagation nursery. So their nurseries' job is to propagate the plant, started from seeds, started from cuttings, tissue culture, grow them to this size, and then we take them and put them in bigger pots and grow them ourselves. They use pure peat. They know what they're doing. they don't fool around with any of the bark stuff. I had one nursery back in the 80s. We tried them once. And I think this was the 90s. And they were growing their stuff in pure bark. We got some lavenders from them. Some of the lavenders live, but every single English lavender, or 70% of them, with just this little bit of bark around them, they died. So we know lavenders extremely, especially English lavenders, extremely sensitive to having any compost or bark around their crown of their plant, just a little tiny bit. If it's in peat, we got no problems. This was in peat before we put in our top pot. But just a little bit of that bark was real nasty on them. So we have to watch what suppliers we get these things from too. But pretty much all of them. I talked to a supplier down in the San Diego area, and he says we were using bark for a while, but we're switching back to peat. They know the bark is it's not, it's not good enough to root a plant out. Why is it good enough to grow them bigger? That's nice. And in fact, we used to get these plumerias in there in pure, what looked like shredded cedar wood from one of the local growers. Plant had leaves, had flowers, pull out of the pot. It had one root on the bottom of it this long. That's what they were sending us. One stick of a plumeria with the root this long on it. It's a succulent, so surviving in that soil, they're using the bark because you don't need much roots to hold the bark together. In fact, bark, put in a pot, it holds together pretty well. You pull it out, it's all stuck together. But if you put it in sand, you need a heck of a better root system to hold that together than one root. One root won't hold it. You pull it out of the pot, everything just falls apart. So they found for their own purposes, they can put this stuff in shredded bark and sell it when it started to leaf out and bloom. One root. We took those and just put in our soil to get a better root system. But it's I think that covered it. So next week we'll talk about how to fix the plants that we get from the growers. Um, some plants we sell in bark because they don't need to be fixed, like Ulstramarias. They don't like bark, but Ulstramarias are nice because they move. So this plant has underground rhizomes that just pop out of there, and within a year they're over here and over here and over here. They're not in that soil anymore, so this soil may kill them in the meantime. What's in that, but what's out here is healthy. So there are a lot of plants like that, cannas, a lot of the lilies, um, blackberries, raspberries, things like that. They get out of that soil real fast. Doesn't seem to bother them very long. Yes.
Seminars, water. And water from your hose is basically got,
Got oxygen in it.
yeah, it doesn't have enough oxygen in it. Its rain has much more oxygen in it. So if you're watering your plants with hose, technically it isn't giving that plant as much oxygen.
As rainwater would, certainly.
So what I did, I started pouring rainwater. And I would just put the rainwater on the plants. But at some point, the rain's going away. And so, is there a better way to oxygenate the water?
No, sprinklers. Just use, on your hose, put a thing on there that aerates the water.
But this is for containers.
Yeah. Well, the tap water has supposed to have by law 5 to 7 parts per million oxygen in the water to keep the plants alive. And that's usually adequate. I mean, just be aware that if you store water in a bucket outside, if it gets 100 degrees in there in a can on a sunny day, no oxygen left. So hot water.
Yeah, it'll be later.
Right. So if you collect water, don't store it too long without, it's like we had a growing ground 10 years ago. We had a growing ground in Irvine. We had these big water things. We made sure, we had to pump the water out of there and put it through a sprayer into the plants. because there's algae in that water. There's probably no oxygen or not much enough oxygen in that water to keep to be the healthiest it could be. Plus, it was warm in there too. In the summertime, it heated up the water. So we made sure we aerated the water as we watered plants in pots. Um, so yeah, there's different things to watch, and like there's this thing called what's that? Compost tea. Just be aware if you make compost tea, there's no oxygen in that water at all. You water a plant with that, and if that soil doesn't breathe well on its own, you can kill that plant with that. The compost tea, properly made, has got this aerator in it. You got to keep the oxygen level up in that, or else it becomes a lethal medium.
It seems to me, I heard something in the news like last year that the city of Irvine or one of them is in trouble because they have a recycling water program, and the water that we were recycling through the program wasn't oxygenated properly,
That can happen.
and it was causing failure.
That's happened in agriculture too. They watered a orchard with this reclaimed sewer water, and they said it was at 2%, 2 parts per million oxygen just wiped out the whole orchard. So yeah, the water has to have enough oxygen in it. I mean, in those days they flood irrigated the field, so just no more air in the water. So,
Gary, what can you do with compost? I mean, just compost it and then use it like a mulch or something.
yeah, just use it as a mulch. I mean, more is better, and you don't have to put in a compost pile first because it's a different system. The mycorrhizal fungus is not necessarily friendly to the compost bacteria, and the mycorrhizal, they said, is generally faster than compost bacteria at making the. See, for a compost bacteria to get the nutrients back to the plants, the compost bacteria actually has to die, and then whatever is from its body goes into the soil, and the plants get it. This mycorrhizal fungus, this job is to eat up this stuff and transfer it directly to the plant. From the plant, this mycorrhizal fungus gets sugar because the body of the fungus is cellulose, which is sugar. So the fungus gets sugar from the plant in return for nitrogen, all the minerals in there, potassium, phosphorus, all that stuff. The fungus gives to the tree. Um, so what we know in nature is said that nature, this fungus is the king of the garden. It's the king of the forest. There's one mycorrhizal fungus that can be attached to hundreds of trees. And whatever the mycorrhizal fungus does, it helps the trees out. They said it connects that group of trees together so they all get the same nutrients, they all get the same water. They said this fungus can transfer water from tree to tree. I think it was 50 or 70 yards from the riverbed. It can transfer the water from root to root to root. This fungus. So they said the biggest organisms on Earth are just large single mycorrhizal fungi.
You say they work against each other, the compost and the mycorrhizal?
They're not friendly, right?
Well, okay, so if you put, your eggshells and manganese from the carrot tops and all this stuff and it decomposes, that's sort of like some nutrients, right? I
Right.
would think it would provide some nutrients.
Yeah, that's probably
But-
helps the bacteria and the fungus, either one.
But they're working against each other? They're not friendly to each
Well, they're
other?
not friendly. I don't know if they work against each
Yeah.
other, but so
So
I
it's
mean,
okay.
in a lot of if you get any Dr. fertilizer product off the shelf, they put in there all the mycorrhizal fungi that they can, and all the soil bacteria they can. They want to make sure that their fertilizers work better because it's organic. It's got to be broken down either by the fungus or the bacteria, so they include that in there. Now, back in this is next week's lecture, so they put it in there. The interesting about fungus is that these fungus roots can transmit electricity. So they said the fungal roots in the ground are almost like a nervous system. They said when you walk in a forest, the trees know you're walking by them. The mycorrhizal fungus has all these electrical impulses that let them know what's going on. So the trees are talking to each other through their fungus system. So generally, you don't have to add this to the ground. It's there. I actually talked to a professor at UC Riverside that went up to Mount St. Helens. They wanted to see how, after that volcanic blast, what was that, 1980? They said like a couple hundred square miles are covered in a new layer of ash. And they saw the seeds sprouting and dying, sprouting and dying. There wasn't any fungus there to help them out. Within 5 years, they all survived. So it only took 5 years for that mycorrhizal fungus to repopulate that whole blast zone around that volcano and get the trees going again.
What about the manure? Is that what is a compost thing?
Oh yeah, anything that was alive is fine. It's all, whatever was alive is now a good source of nutrients. I mean, animals, people, we're all made out of the same minerals, very similar. So, and well, I could, one more thing. If you have clay soil or any soil that's on the heavy side, nature has ways of making it more airy. So there's, of course, there's worms, things like that. So what happens is, as organic matter breaks down, the things that hold organic matter together, hold wood together. So it's strands of cellulose, which is wood, uh, glued together with a chemical called lignin. Both cellulose is a converted sugar molecule, and lignin is also a converted sugar molecule. The plant uses to glue together the cellulose molecules, strands of cellulose. As things decompose, the lignin is released in the soil. Nothing eats the lignin, nothing happens to lignin. The lignin then glues the small soil particles together in a bigger particle. So if you have a clay soil with lots of little particles, they get glued together into larger particles that start acting like sand. So that's called granulation, aggregation of the soil by decomposing organic matter. So you can make clay better just by throwing a bunch of organic matter on top and waiting. Um, the mycorrhizal fungi in the ground and the roots of the plants hold that structures real stiff, so that as the worms punch holes through it too, they said that if you go into an old forest, even if the soil is clay there, it looks like Swiss trees if you dig through the soil, because the worms, amoebas, all the little organisms in the soil punch holes through that soil, and the structure is held together with the mycorrhizal fungi and the plant roots. So it's supposed to be a pretty strong structure. So they're trying to tell the farmers, and for most crops, don't till the soil. You till it, you're messing up the mycorrhizal fungi. The only plants that like tilled soil are the the cabbage, broccoli family, some grasses, because they don't particularly like the mycorrhizal fungus around. Their root systems operate on their own.
So at home, if you have your garden or something, you don't want to be shifting the soil. I mean, like say you got weeds, like maybe hoeing weeds or.
But that doesn't well, it hurts the mycorrhizal fungus, but that will recover from that pretty quickly. But yeah, you don't want to do tilling. I mean, turn over your whole ground, because you've turned the mycorrhizal world upside down. It's got to restart.
Yeah, years ago, read like the wrote out, but they're talking about the shovel, the stick, and they said double digger.
Yeah, yeah, they're trying not to do that much more. Yeah, nature sets up a nice soil for the plants. It knows what it's doing. I lost my thought. I was going to say something. Um, so if you make raised beds in the ground, like this was like 20 minutes ago, I started saying. So sandy loam is good in a raised bed. Decomposed granite, which is coarser sandy loam, is good in a raised bed too. Pure sand is fine. We've grown a lot of plants in pure sand in a raised bed. Raising the bed makes it drain faster because the soil below it's still sucking the water out of it. What's interesting is that in the strawberry fields in Irvine, which has this soil, for a strawberry plant to make it real happy, they raise the beds 18 inches. And that gives more air to the roots of the strawberries. They grow, nice big strawberry plants, big berries. But they grow a lot of strawberries in Central Coast California, where it's really clay. Monterey area, really clay. Um, and they show videos of the fields in Monterey. Those clay beds to grow strawberries, they raise in 3 feet. So they showed videos of the kids running through the fields. You just see the tops of their heads and run through the fields because those beds are 3 foot high. They cover in plastic so the rain doesn't wash them down. But they have to raise them 3 foot to get the same results with their strawberries. So clay raised up high enough still gives you that good aeration of the soil. The water gets pulled down toward soil level, and then the air goes in after it, and the roots still get breathed real well. 3 foot of clay raised up. Now, it's totally different if you have an elevated bed. So if you have a bed that's elevated off the ground, so there's no contact essentially in the container. And so, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, someone down in San Juan called me up and says, "We have all these raised beds. What soil do you use?" I said, "Well, get the cheapest stuff, San Juan." And they tell me it wasn't working. Things weren't growing. And then they sent me a picture of elevated beds. They weren't raised beds. They were elevated off the ground. This stuff in elevated bed doesn't drain at all. Nothing grew in it. I mean, they grew small, real small plants in sand loam or an elevated bed. So I apologize as well. Yeah, you should have told me it was an elevated bed, not a raised bed. So, but yeah, you can you've got clay soil. What my mother did at her house, she had clay soil, and we redid her yard in the '90s. You put a mixture of decomposed granite and sandy loam. One of my employees, who was the landscaper, liked the mixture of decomposed granite and sandy loam. So he just covered her backyard with 8 inches of this, and plants that hadn't grown in 40 years suddenly just took off. So they grew much faster in the looser soil than they did in the clay soil she had. But there's almost got comical because plants in this mixture in the backyard, they're just too big. We're getting these plants are just this crazy size. They're going, okay, this is not right. Sometimes soil is just too vigorous. So you have to watch. I did the same. I had a rose garden in my front yard. Now this is going to be Toots' lecture. You plant roses once in the garden, you can't go ahead and plant them again. They won't grow well the second time. So we took out that soil, put in a real almost pure sandy soil on there. So my floor abundance, which are normally this high, were like this high. We're going, okay, this isn't right. You can't see the house behind you. There's a bed of roses. So florist growers use sand to grow their roses because they want the longest stems. They grow really tall in sand. So you want something to grow fast, you put it in sand or tall. You have to water and fertilize it, but as long as you do that, they grow. So
So if we have a new raised bed that's in contact with the ground, how do you recommend filling that up to get enough with
sandy loam works.
sand?
Well,
where do you get the sandy loam? I mean, where do you?
what city are you in?
Right here in San Juan.
So you got some choices. There are building supply material places around. There's Aguanaga, Green, and Santa Ana this way. There's probably several Thompson's building supplies.
Yeah.
Up here at Bill Park, there's Blue Rhythm. And they all have this and this.
Okay.
Just be careful if it says topsoil. So the big warning we have, don't ever buy anything called topsoil.
Okay.
Now, there in nature there is topsoil. It's the top layer of soil that's in the ground. Now, if you're in New England, by law, when they build houses, they can't scrape away the dirt and put you on bedrock. They have to scrape off what is called the topsoil, set aside, build your house, and put it back so you have decent soil to live on, not just rocks or clay or bedrock. Here, they don't have that law, so you can end up with something really bad. But the topsoil that these building supply people make, they don't know anything about plants. So they take perfectly good sandy loam and mix it with manure and compost. This is good topsoil because it's got all this nutrition in it. And what we've seen is it's 40 to 50% organic, and 50 to 60% mineral. And that's one of the ways I learned about soil because when I bought my last house, I filled up all these raised planters with their topsoil and things died in there. We're going, okay, this is before I met the soil scientists. We go, okay, that's not working. How come I can't grow plants and this stuff that they recommended? So the soil companies, well, we learned the soil company I got this from, they test the soil by putting tomatoes in it. If it can grow tomato, it must be good soil. So that's the whole problem with the industry is that they don't check what they should be checking is, put gardenia or strawberries in that soil, see if it grows, not tomato plants. So don't buy anything called topsoil, but sandy loam, which is often called filtered. So a construction company, they have a hole in the ground they need to fill. They don't want to put clay in there because clay is terrible to work with. It shrinks and expands. They want a very sandy soil, so they often call sandy loam filtered. But you look at it, you can see the sand in there. Sometimes it gets a little gravelly if it's filtered. That doesn't hurt plants at all. So look at the quality. Decomposed granite grows good plants. It's against the same thing. It's just not been churned up real fine. But a lot of people like working with decomposed granite because the plants, putting vegetables there, they come out really clean.
You can just get a mix of both.
Or you can do a mix. I mean, you go down to Larry's Building Materials in Costa Mesa, which is now in Santa Ana. They moved. They call this mixture Rick's Mix. So Rick Cross, the work for us, he had always had them doing that mixture of half decomposed granite and half sand, so they ended up calling it Rick's Mix. And so you go down there, ask for Rick's Mix, they'll just mix it for you. It doesn't cost any more than either one, which are all, essentially this stuff is dirt cheap. Lately I got a load of it. I filled the back of my pickup one scoop. One scoop is supposed to be 12 and a half cubic feet. It's really more like 18 because they don't level off their scoop. So it was like with tax and everything, 50 something dollars for half a yard or 18 cubic foot of decomposed granite versus it would cost you if you bought our top pot, which works really well too. What happened? $500. That'd be no, that'd be half yard 18 bags is 103. Well, it's a lot.
So I'm not gonna be loading up my truck today with this stuff. So.
But if you have money, because I have a customer who's the wife of a retired doctor, she buys 100 bags every year. We ship 100 bags to her property. And she buys 100 bags of the most expensive compost we sell, Happy Frog from Fox Farm. She gets good results, and it's lighter to carry than. But yeah, decomposed granite, like my friend's farm, after they plow this, it's like walking on a beach. You're not getting anywhere very fast because it's so soft. Decomposed granite, the nice thing about it is firm. It doesn't move much.
Now, where did you say you ought to get the scoop?
I went to Blue Ribbon up here, but any building supply should have this stuff.
Okay. This may be next week's lecture. If you said that usually when you replace the roads, you have to take out all the soil and start over again.
We rotate cross because of the dead stuff that plants leave behind. You can't get rid of it. You just